Good evening, everyone. Hope you're well. Welcome to Blogging Theology. Can someone just say the volume is okay? Can you see and hear me all right? Hopefully someone can hear and see me. One or two people out there. Hello. So, salam alaikum. Can you hear me all right? Hopefully you can. So hopefully Calamology can come on, even if very briefly, to tonight. And it's been a great week, actually, on Blogging Theology. We've had two amazing guests, actually. Professor John Barton from the University of Oxford, author of this recent book, A History of the Bible, the book and its faiths. Lovely human being, actually, very soft-spoken, very gentle, but some powerful things he said. And you can see some I've done a couple of extracts that you can see on there. For example, in Mark chapter 10, where Jesus denies he is God. And Professor Barton acknowledges that Matthew, who used Mark, dishonestly changed, watered down Jesus' denial that he is God in Matthew's version, so that his late first century readers in Matthew's time would not feel perhaps offended by this unacceptable denial by Jesus, at least in Mark's gospel. Extraordinary. And the other guest we had, equally distinguished, author of this book and many more, Professor Dale Allison from Princeton University. Fascinating author, fascinating writer, actually. He writes very in a very fascinating way, bringing in lots of different references from literature and scholarship and history. It's a real pleasure to read him. And you can see the video I did with him yesterday, what he said there. And a surprising book in terms of its popularity is this one by Mustafa al-Badari, the psychiatrist. There's some more juicy extracts I want to share with you from this work. He did a chapter on the Dajjal, the Antichrist, which I thought was really insightful. And he has lots more to say as well. So that's kind of the focus of the live stream for Q&A. If you have any other questions, I'll try and deal with them. No promises. As I hopefully one or two people can come on and join as well, but we'll see. In the meantime, let me see what the questions might have. Salam from Florida, USA. Salam. Hi. Salam from London, England, the old world. So let's have a look through. Let's have a scroll. What's it about? This stream is about those subjects. In other words, Blogging Theology's videos in the last 7 days, and the speakers that we've been very, very lucky to have on. There are more very exciting speakers coming in the coming weeks and even the coming months, actually, as well. Salam from Brussels, amazing, Belgium. Salam from Baghdad, fantastic. And Dubai, salam there. Please explain the contradiction in the Bible that you get from these world-class scholars. Whoop, that's the wrong one. My apologies. Where's it gone? Oh, there we go. This ticker tape is moving up so quickly that salam from Bahrain, Canada, Oman, Trinidad and Tobago. So I'm just looking at Australia. Amazing. Truly global. Kashmir. Salam from Kashmir. Did Jesus predict his imminent death? Salam from Seattle, Washington, Northwest America, and Paris. I'll be in France in a week's time, God willing. Please explain the contradiction in the Bible that you get from these world-class scholars. Before I go to that, we have a guest, I'm very pleased to say.
Well, hello, Paul. Hello, everybody.
Salam.
Alaikum salam. Sorry, I'm not able to use my camera. I'm at work. I have some downtime. Figured to jump in and say hi to you a little bit.
Fantastic. I'm glad you could join us, actually. It's always a pleasure having you on live stream, I must say. How are you doing in New York?
Pretty good. A little busy here. COVID stuff up and down. So right now, today's pretty okay. So not too many admissions.
Really? So it's still a problem in New York then, COVID, I mean?
It's up and down, and you got to deal with also people with comorbidities, people with chronic diseases. They're obviously a high risk. So we're still dealing with the secondary stuff regarding to their chronic diseases.
Gosh, amazing. Well, good luck with that. And how's your channel going? Because I do recommend folks. What's your channel, and where can we find it on YouTube, Callum?
Oh, thank you. It's Kalamology, Kalamology. Basically, we do debates, polemics, interviews, etc. I haven't done much work, to be honest with you, since the end of Ramadan until now. Been a little busy with work, but we're gonna jump in again and bring some new stuff soon, inshallah.
Good, yeah, because your channel is very much on the up and up, isn't it? It has some great videos. Do recommend people have a look and subscribe to the content.
Thanks, Paul.
So any did you see any of the videos this week at all with some of the scholars I was fortunate enough to meet, like John Barton or Dale Allison?
I was actually watching Dale Allison, your interview with him. Quite interesting, actually. Maybe we should get together sometime soon and discuss it more and ask you some more questions about it.
What did you think? I mean, did anything strike you about the interview or what he said at all?
I haven't finished it, but I watched the beginning, up to like half mark. And it was pretty much interesting when he was sharing his views on how he was disappointed growing up from things that he learned from his bishops, etc. And then when he got to the academic world, found new things, and how it's that shocking to a lot of people, and how he received a lot of letters all the time of people telling him, well, I didn't know this was going to happen, but I'll just do whatever I need to do to finish my course and get out of here. Yeah. That's pretty interesting.
No, you're right. I mean, this is that's my experience. When I was a Christian, I had all these issues. I used to, you know, like many people, you read books and things and think, oh my God, how do I reconcile this with my faith? I mean, these weren't trivial objections. They were really fundamental. Like, who was Jesus? You know, and you know, so people, you write to scholars and you ask them for help, and they don't always provide it. Sometimes they just compound the questions and say, well, you know, there are even more issues. And I'm not sure he gives answers. I think he just rides the questions. He says, well, these are the issues we have to wrestle with, and it's a lifetime. He says a lifetime journey, isn't it, for wrestling with them? But you know, it doesn't provide. I mean, he's actually at a seminary, so he's training priests and ministers. And I thought that, you know, if you took his courses, you wouldn't come away with a firmer faith. You come away with a more doubtful, questioning position, I think. But
yeah, very interesting. Yeah, so you know, I've been doing lately some studying. I'm taking it one book at a time. I just finished the book of Luke, and it is interesting to find this idea of transfiguration. You know, I don't know whether you already started the topic or you had a question already, so I don't want to kind of troll in the middle here.
No, I mean, I appreciate I've only got you for a few minutes. Well, what was the question again?
It's more like something I realized that it's obviously everyone knows about it. It's in the Bible. It's mentioned in the book of Mark, Matthew, Luke, etc. Even in John. This concept of transfiguration of Jesus Christ. I feel like it's very underrated. We don't put too much emphasis on this topic, and it's quite fascinating if you think about it. So based on the Bible, Jesus had the ability to transfigure and change faces. Now, this can be connected with, again, quote unquote, post-resurrection part where Jesus was walked into two men. They were walking towards Jerusalem, and they didn't recognize him. And he's like, what are you guys talking about? And they told him the story of this Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet in front of God and all, and was crucified. We thought he was going to be the Messiah to save Israel. And then he explained to them, oh, you fools, didn't you know the prophecies in the Psalms, etc.? Yeah. And then they said that their eyes were cleared and they were able to see him. Same thing happened in the book of John, where the disciples didn't recognize him when they were fishing. And same thing happened also in the book of Luke when he went up to pray with the disciples, and then he transfigured, his face changed. So he had the ability to change. I think it's interesting to do more research about this topic and find out whether it could have played any role in terms of switching faces with Simon Peter, etc. You know, just something to think about.
Oh, I see. Does this connect with the view that some Muslims have that you know, the appearance of Jesus or the appearance of perhaps of another disciple changed, and they in fact were the ones that went to the cross rather than the actual real Jesus? Is that
this idea, as you know, comes from early Christians. There were sects who thought this swine theory, whether it was Peter, Simon who took it, because we all must remember it's kind of ambiguous when you read, because at some point it says the disciples fled and left him, and then at one point you find that Simon Peter was there carrying the cross. So we don't know what the author, whether he meant suddenly, Peter appears to be carrying the cross, meaning Jesus transfigured, or whether suddenly he just showed up. We don't know what's going on exactly. It's ambiguous. And this theory is not only by Muslims. As a matter of fact, Ibn Kathir, in his book, Stories of the Prophets, he gets this out of something called Israeliyat, which is the Israelite stories. So this is obviously something that the early believers had in their mind, whether it was someone else, whether... It's just interesting to know that he had the ability to transfigure, yet he was praying to be saved. So is it possible that the transfiguration happened and someone else, the looks of Jesus would put on him, whether it was Peter, Simon as volunteer, or whether it was the one who betrayed him, Judas? It's just something to a field to research and explore more.
I think because there's such little information in the Quran about what happened to Jesus, that I think many of the early Muslims wanted just to fill in the holes or gaps, so to speak, in their understanding, and so they kind of drew on Israeliyat, kind of stories circulating amongst Christians and Jews. And I mean, that's ambiguous because we don't know how reliable these traditions were, how historical they were. Are they myths? And so I don't think the Quran always gives us all the information we would like. It's not there to provide a theology or a historical record of everything in Jesus' life. But yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah, the transfiguration and the resurrection. Yeah, I find it interesting in that narrative in Luke where you mentioned the story is called the Road to Emmaus. That's how it's usually called in Christian.
Right. That's the one.
And you get two disciples who are walking along a road, and a third joins them. This Jesus, and the disciples tell Jesus, not realizing who he was, what's happening, and they said, "A great prophet has been among us." And it's interesting how they identify him correctly as a prophet. They don't say, "Oh my God, God incarnate has come down," a prophet. And then when they eat, it's with the breaking of bread. So this is kind of a Eucharistic. Catholics is a Eucharistic kind of trope here. Then they recognize who Jesus is in the breaking of the bread. So you get this Eucharistic kind of symbolism there as well. But Jesus in Luke says, how slow he chastises them a little bit, how slow they are to realize that his death and resurrection are mentioned, in the prophets and the Psalms all over the Old Testament. But the odd thing is that in none of these narratives does Jesus ever say which texts, because historians have never found any texts in the Jewish Bible that ever say that the Messiah would die for people's sins.
In fact, we find the opposite.
It's simply not there at all. So this is very curious. If Jesus is a Jewish rabbi, a prophet, that he should basically make stuff up like this and say, "Oh, look in the Bible, how slow you are. It's all there." But when you look there, it's not there. So that this has perplexed historians, and many think that this is not historical, that narrative, because it reflects later Christians sort of retrospectively trying to justify their beliefs by saying, well, it really is there in the Bible, but when you look, it's not actually there. I mean, if it was there, we'd say so, but there's nowhere in the Old Testament it says the Messiah will die for people's sins and rise again on the third day. But that is precisely what Paul claims in 1 Corinthians, but it's simply not there. I've never seen it, and I've read the whole book, so it's very curious.
Something, Paul, there's actually the opposite is there. Look at the book of Psalm. It says that God will save him, the angel will lift him up. He shall not, no harm shall come near him, etc. It's talking about the Messiah, the Christ, that he will be saved and the angel will save him, and no harm shall touch him. And if you look in the book of Luke, also in earlier chapters, he explains this too. And the author of the book quotes these things, quotes David in a psalm, saying that he'll be basically no harm will touch him and all that. So for Jesus to mention these things, it tells me that he's mentioning to them that the point that is that I'm supposed to be saved. No harm should touch me. Now, of course, it's not mentioned in details, but if he was going to mention any prophecy, it would have been the prophecy that no harm has touched him. And that he was lifted up. And remember another thing to mention also, this idea of rise, raise, rise up, raising up. It's similar to the verb in Arabic or Aramaic, rafa'a, which means to lift up, meaning to move from point A to point B. So now, from a Christian perspective, because we're familiar with the modern or 2,000-year-old Christian narrative, when we read that word verb raise, we think of it all the time as it means raise from the dead. but that's not necessarily the case all the time. The verb in Greek there has also the meaning of, someone who stands up, someone who is lifted up. And again, if you think this is goes hand in hand with the Islamic narrative, which is rafa'ahu Allahu ilayhi, Allah has lifted him up to him. So not necessarily lift him up from death or raise him up. It can also mean to raise him. Again, it needs some obviously some more research and more time to be put in for this subject matter.
No, I agree. And on a different matter, when Professor John Barton from Oxford, we were talking about the Gospels, and it was a stunning, very candid admission from him that Matthew had dishonestly changed Mark, because Matthew used Mark in the writing of his Gospel to heighten the status of Jesus. To the denial of Jesus being God in Mark is watered down, he put it. And the status of Jesus thereby elevated to even a divine status. And that's an extraordinary admission from one of the world's leading world-class biblical scholars, that a gospel writer himself was dishonest in changing the words of Jesus to reflect their own beliefs rather than what Jesus truly was. And I've not come across such an admission before, in public anyway.
By the way, Paul, do you have any moderators for your chat or no? Because I see some trolls there. I see some people trolling, full of energy there, and I wish they could just ask us straight question, or maybe you can provide them link to come up here.
I don't know. I don't have a moderator, unfortunately.
Okay, no problem.
Saturday night's not a great time. The other moderators often have their own live streams.
Okay, no problem.
It's actually on his channel at the moment, talking about something else. The Cadiani's, I think it is.
Okay. Yeah, I think he did one yesterday as well. Because I see here like a person named Alika here, and has been constantly non-stop trolling and just throwing allegations on Islam and Muslims. I mean,
I just ignore people. I just ignore people. I just ignore people if they're irrelevant. I'm interested in relevant questions.
Right.
For example, please invite Dr. Ali at it. I have, and I'm very pleased to say he is coming on in a couple of weeks, and I'll let you know the exact date. So I'm very honored to say that he is coming on. Now, he's a professor at the Zaytuna Institute in California, one of a very distinguished scholar there. He's fluent, amazingly, in Arabic, in Greek, in Hebrew, and he even speaks English, which is amazing. So I know he's done some amazing work on the Quran and Christianity and the Bible. So I have lots of questions for him, as you can imagine. So that's amazing news. I'll put up some more information in due course about that, but he is confirmed.
I think there's a question there by the same person, Alika. She said, or he said, what I know what this person is. I asked a question and was called a liar when you could confirm it with the use of your fingers. I think what she was talking about, I'm assuming it's a female, as she introduced herself earlier. She said that the king of Saudi Arabia is planning to delete 90% of the hadith. Now, how do you even take this such person seriously?
Ignore it. I mean, let it through, and I'm not going to sweat about it. If people want to believe that, they can. I mean, Saudi Arabia is the last place on earth, I think, where they would delete.
Dear! I mean, we're here to try to talk about theology. This is an academic platform. We welcome questions.
Indeed, but it is what it is. So let's look at this one. From the Muslim Chaplain. What are your thoughts on the new English translation, Full Notes edition with over 60K of translators? Do you know, I'm not familiar with that particular edition with the notes, so I have to say I don't know. I'll look into it. Do you know, there's so many new translations and new editions, study Bibles, study Qurans coming out now. As industries producing these things. In some ways, it's a good thing. So, no, I'll have to look into that. I'm sorry, I don't have the answer to that at this stage. Assalamu alaikum, brothers and brother Khalil. Yeah, thank you. Salam to you, brother. This is an interesting question. What did early Christians believe in the crucifixion or about the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus? Well, that's a very big subject, and all I can say is one of the things that we have to change our conceptual, our thinking about this, if one looks at this more in a scholarly way, is to understand that there were many different kinds of Christianity. There were Christianities in the 1st century and the 2nd century too. There wasn't the orthodox traditional Catholic view which emerged in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, where Jesus' death and resurrection had a particular meaning for people. The thing is, we don't really, apart from Paul, in my view, who never met Jesus, we don't actually have any eyewitness first-person accounts in the New Testament of people who knew Jesus. 1 and 2 Peter are commonly seen as forgeries, particularly 2 Peter, which claims to be eyewitness testimony of Jesus' ministry, is universally seen by historians and experts as a fake. It's a forgery, and it's in the Bible. Matthew's gospel is not written by an eyewitness. People used to believe that 200-300 years ago, but no, historians today don't think that anymore. So he's not an eyewitness. Neither's Mark, neither's Luke, of course. John is not an eyewitness. So, we don't really know what Jesus' own disciples believe, but we know what some of the followers of Jesus believed, that those who were in the same camp as Paul, if you like. But others were very opposed to Paul, particularly James, the brother of Jesus, who was the head of the church in Jerusalem. And we know he was basically a Jew, a Torah-observant Jew, who would have had a very traditional understanding of the Messiah's role, and wouldn't perhaps have seen his brother as God or as gone through a sacrifice for sin. And even Luke's gospel portrays Jesus as a martyr. So what did the early Christians believe about the crucifixion? Well, for Luke, the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is a martyr. He doesn't die as a sacrifice for sin. So that's quite different from Mark, who in Mark 10:45 sees Jesus as, in some sense, a ransom, a sacrifice for sin. So they're different views, different people. And then you get other early Christian texts which are not in the Bible, which we now have, like the Didache. Didache is a Greek word meaning teaching. And this text, you can read it today, read it online, probably comes from either the late 1st century or the 2nd century. Some scholars date it to the 50s, the 1st century. And where Jesus is spoken of there, he is spoken of as a servant of God. And when it talks about the Eucharist or the Last Supper, there is no sense, and this is really important, there is no sense that Jesus was a sacrifice for sin. There's no mention of his body and blood. It's the same meal, the Last Supper, that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians, but in the Didache, it's a very early Christian tradition, there is no mention of the body and blood of Jesus. So it's not a sacrifice. It's simply a meal. And Jesus is referred to as a servant of God, and God is mentioned as a separate person. So, there are other non-traditional Christian narratives that go right back to the 1st century, which give us a very different picture of these matters. But as I say, the problem is, in my view, we don't have any first-person accounts from people. We don't have letters from Peter. I know the Bible says we do, but they're forgeries, according to most people. We don't have a letter from James. I know we have a letter from James, but the word Jacob in Hebrew is a very, very common name in the 1st century. Lots of people are called James, and lots of Jameses in the New Testament. And it doesn't say, the author of James, who he is. I mean, who are you, Mr. James? It doesn't say, I'm the brother of Jesus. It could be by Jesus' brother. I'm not saying it's not, but we don't know that it is. It's just James. And so we don't really have that first-hand evidence. Like, we've got these Sahih hadiths in Islam, and we've got these narrations that go back with excellent isnads and Bukhari and Muslim. You don't have that in Christianity. So you're left that's where you've got this industry of biblical scholarship to try and get back to the earliest possible Jesus tradition to find out what actually happened. And it's ambiguous. Scholars, as we saw in Professor Dale Allison. Why are all biblical scholars in America called Dale? I don't know. Anyway, Dale Allison.
I'm sorry, Paul. They're calling me right now, so I have to get going.
Okay, sorry, Ken.
No problem. It was nice talking to you for a few minutes.
Thank you. We'll speak again. Do come on.
Have a good salam to you and everyone.
Salam to you. Khalid is a physician, a doctor in New York, and he has an amazing job, very responsible job. So wish him well in his looking after patients in their time of need. So as I was saying with Dale Allison yesterday from Princeton, he's very humble in ways. He said we don't really know so much. We don't know really what happened in the resurrection. The lot we don't know, it's mysterious. So there we go. So I'm not looking at the questions. I've been preoccupied. Let's have a look at this. Changing the subject. It's not really an academic question. I'll just throw it up anyway. When is it allowed to hit women in the Quran in 434? Is this supported by latest science? Is the correct way to stop abuse? Well, I think, I'm not a scholar. I'm just giving you my personal opinion for what it's worth, and it may be worth very little. The problem with this text, Quran 434, is what does it mean? And Sunni Muslims, don't just read the Quran without any context. It's read through the prism of the Prophet himself, through the Sunnah of the Prophet. That's how the Quran has always been read right from the beginning. And so like many verses in the Quran, you've got to understand it in its fuller context in terms of the context of the life of the Prophet, his teaching, his example, and also that of the Sahaba and so on. The Prophet himself never, according to the accounts, never hit a wife. But he did say about this kind of thing that it's not, it's to be done in a way after a long series. If you read the whole passage, after a long series of chastisements and not sleeping with the person and rebuke and so on, that almost like a symbolic striking is permitted at the end of that process, even with a miswak, which is a kind of like a toothbrush, the Prophet mentioned. So this is not quite as bloodthirsty as it seems at first glance. It's, I said, in my view, it's more symbolic, but it's there, and it offends against many Western kind of feelings about this, but it is what it is, and it's Muslims view it as the word of God. But we must read the Quran through the Sunnah of the Prophet. He didn't beat his wife, he didn't beat his wives, and he did say it's like the hand chopping. The Quran says thieves have to have their hands chopped off, the hudud punishments, and yet there are so many caveats attached to this in the Sunnah of the Prophet and in the madhabs. It's got to be the item stolen. It's got to be public property. It's got to be. It can't be public property. Then it doesn't apply. It's got to be of a certain value. The person's got to be. There's a very long list of caveats and qualifications before you ever get to the point. And hudud punishments are supposed to be warded off as well. So this is a complex subject, and some people like to pick on isolated verses that are sensationalist. When you look at the detail this is not like revisionist Islam, Western liberal Islam. When you look at classical Islam, normative Islam, Sunni Islam, you'll see that many of these shocking verses to us in our Western context are not quite what they seem, but they are there, and I'm not going to pretend they're not there. And God knows best, and questions like this will always be addressed to scholars and people of knowledge, and I'm not one of them, obviously. But I thought at least I'd mention that. So another question, what about the hadiths, the Sahih hadiths? What about them? One of the books I recommend, if you're a Westerner, an English-speaking Westerner, this book called Hadith, Muhammad's Legacy in the Medieval World, second edition, by Jonathan A.C. Brown, who's professor in America. He happens to be a Muslim. On the back here, a professor of Arabic and Islamic studies at the University of Oxford, Christopher Melchert, writes about this book. Far surpasses all previous introductory surveys. It is especially distinguished by its attention to hadith scholarship throughout the Middle Ages, not just the age of the great collectors. So Western scholars think it's great. And then Hamza Yusuf, the president and co-founder of Zaytuna, says on the back, this work is, in my opinion, without parallel in the English language. Stunning in its scope, it enables one to grasp a highly complex subject in well-written and clear prose. Essential reading. So if you're a Westerner and you want a really good book in English, this is the one. I have read it, and anything by Jonathan Brown is worth reading. I think I don't always necessarily agree with his conclusions. I don't mean on Hadith. He's got a PhD in Hadith, but I mean on perhaps on other subjects. But this is a book to have in your personal library if you want to have a good foundation in Islam, in my view. So there we go. Just having a look now at, hopefully it might be some, oh yeah, that's an interesting question. From Tam. Can you share with us a summary of Josephus's narration opinion on Jesus? This is a very, very interesting question. Well, I think it is anyway. Who was Josephus? Josephus was a Jewish historian in the 1st century. His life overlapped that of Jesus in terms of chronology, and he was part of the uprising. He was a commander in the Jewish armies that rebelled against Rome in AD 70, well, the wars that led up to the destruction of the temple in AD 70, and then he was captured. And it's a very colorful life. Anyway, he basically defected to the enemy and found himself a favorite of a guy, Titus, who became the emperor, actually. And Josephus is in many ways a brilliant, brilliant historian. He wrote a great, great deal. But there is in one of his works a brief mention of Jesus. And this is a very interesting mention because he says, well, the manuscripts that we have now, and you can Google, you can read the article on Wikipedia or whatever on this. It's very well known. The manuscripts we have now of this Josephus comment about Jesus say that Jesus, I'm paraphrasing here from memory, Jesus was a man who was crucified. If it be right to call him a man, says Jesus, who was the Messiah, and has followers who are still with us today, and so on. So he describes Jesus in a way that a Christian would describe Jesus. And this has led scholars today to doubt, to think that this description of Jesus as the Messiah, which for a Jew is really important, because here is Josephus, who is known as an Orthodox Jew, saying that Jesus was the Messiah. Doesn't really add up. Nowhere else in his writings does he ever say he's a Christian. So the view now of scholars is that that the text has been interpolated. It's been mixed with. There's been corruption in the text. And if you take off the explicitly Christian bits about Jesus being the Messiah, and if it right to call him a man, implying he was a god, then the text makes perfect sense. So he does mention Jesus, but the way his text has come to us has been corrupted by a later Christian scribe, and this is the consensus of historians now. So that's the problem when dealing with Josephus. But there you go. Worth looking into. How did the resurrection of Jesus develop and improved in Christianity? Yes, this is a good question, actually. And some of the distinguished scholars I had the privilege to talk with, like James Table, Professor James Table, for example. We discussed this at length, or he discussed this in his work, and we talked about it at length in the video. So to make it very brief and simplify it, basically the earliest first-person account of the resurrected Jesus we have in the Bible, in the New Testament, is from the letters of Paul. And we have some of the authentic letters of Paul. We have some forgeries, but some authentic ones as well. And to put it very simply, Paul's understanding of the resurrected Jesus is of a person who had a spiritual body. It was a vision. It was a visionary-like reality. And later, some years later, when the Gospels are written, you find a much more corporeal, much more like an animated corpse resurrection. So in Luke, the Gospel of Luke, Gospel of John, Jesus is much more physical. So he eats food. And in one gospel, a disciple puts his hand on Jesus' side where, the wound was. So the Table's thesis, and I think it has legs, is that the earliest resurrection accounts come from an embellished tradition or led to an embellished tradition. The earliest resurrection accounts were visions, basically, of Jesus, and they became more physicalized with time, as these things tend to do, actually, in religious traditions. The traditions become embellished and changed. We see this in Islam as well, where hadiths are made up and fantastic stories are made up much later. So it's not just Christianity. And I think that's what Tabor says is plausible. And it's a very common opinion amongst some biblical scholars. What are the sources of forgeries in the Bible? Who did it? Well, they're forgeries, so we're not sure. If you want a really good book on forgeries, I just happen to have one. Here we go. Forged by Bart Ehrman, professor. Writing in the Name of God, Why the Bible's Authors Are Not Who We Think They Are. Yeah, so this is written for the general public, and it's a good book. His views are completely mainstream. Don't get the idea. Some Christians will tell you, oh, he's this, he's that. This guy is giving mainstream historical opinion and analysis. If you want a more academic work, this thick book by him called Forgery and Counterforgery, The Use of Literary Deceit in Early Christian Polemics, is my favorite. This is a big fat tome, and it's been reviewed on the back by leading specialists in the field from Duke University, Yale University, Boston University, specialists in this field, and they say it's an outstanding work. This knocks on the head conclusively. Now, in German scholarship, this has been done for some time. It's only in English scholarship we're catching up with German academic work on this in this field, something that Bart Ehrman readily acknowledges. What he's doing, he surveys virtually every example of forgery in the early Christian church and discusses whether or not they are forgeries, what's the evidence, and so on. But what I found interesting was his tackling of the common idea amongst scholars that these forgeries didn't really matter because it was an accepted convention at the time that people would write in the names of other people. So an unknown person would write in the name of Peter or the name of Paul, or even the name of Jesus. There are some letters attributed to Jesus too. And Bart Ehrman demonstrates conclusively that this was not so. The early church utterly abhorred and condemned forgeries as much as we do, actually. And there's no evidence that the early church thought it was acceptable to forge letters in the names of the apostles. So this is a really, really serious problem. And what do we do with that? Well, I discussed this with John Barton and others as well, that, you know, if there are forgeries in the Bible, in the New Testament, this poses a really serious challenge. Can Christians preach from them? Should they read them? Should they take them out of the Bible? How do you deal with it? And it's not my problem at the end of the day, but it's something that the average Christian in the pew will never hear about because they don't listen to their own scholars. And that's another story. So thank you for that question. So I'm just looking through now, catching up with the questions. So this is fun. That's the right word. How do Christians explain the death of Judas, since there are two accounts of his death? Yes, there are two accounts. There's one in Acts and there's one in one of the Gospels. And, well, the Christians are Christians and they're Christians. You get some Christians who are more accepting of the different accounts of stories, say between the Gospels about Jesus' death or his teaching, between John and Mark, for example. There's a huge difference between the Gospel of Mark and John about what Jesus actually taught. Very, very different. Other scholars, other Christians who are inerrantists or fundamentalists will try any mental gymnastics to try and harmonize the accounts. And you can come up with the most perhaps implausible or very sophisticated accounts to try and reconcile these contradictions. You know, whatever the human mind can generate, whatever ingenuity it can provide, it will come up with some way of some crafty story to try and reconcile them. But more perhaps more honest Christians, more liberal Christians maybe, will admit that these stories are different and they are what they are. So that's that. Let's have a look. Just going through again. Scrolling through. What's this say? What are your thoughts on Orientalist school of thought, Patricia Crone, etc.? Is it still to be taken seriously? Any authors who have provided a counter narrative? Well, this is a really complicated question. I mean, this is a Orientalist school of thought. I mean, Western scholars don't agree necessarily. It's not like Western scholars have a view. To take the reliability or unreliability of hadiths, for example. And you can read about this issue in Jonathan Brown's excellent book. He tells us, he shows us that the Western scholars who are more conservative who see that the hadith collections, the Sahih collections, as reliable. There are some Western scholars that do. Others are much more radical and skeptical, and there are many skeptical Western scholars actually who don't see them as reliable. So you take your pick really, and you kind of read them and make up your own mind. In the 1980s and 1970s and the 1980s, there were some revisionist scholars like Patricia Crone and John Wansborough from SOAS here in London, the School of African Oriental Studies, and others like Watt, who proposed completely different theories as to the genesis and the origin of Islam and the Quran. And it's now widely accepted now amongst scholars that these revisionist accounts don't really hold any water. They raise interesting questions, some of them, but a lot of them are not based on any real substantive historical evidence. And they're just trying to provide a different account. So revisionist accounts, although they're still around, have largely been discounted. And according to the Cambridge Companion to the Quran, the traditional Islamic narrative of the origins of the Quran, for example, its compilation and origin, is broadly accepted now amongst Western scholars. But there are some who disagree. I mean, it's not the Westerners have a single view. They have lots of different views, like they do with the Bible. Some Christian scholars are very conservative, and some, like Dale Martin from Yale, for example, is not. He's quite radical in his application of historical criticism. This is a good one. Did zombies of Matthew 27, 51, 53 happen? Well, that's a good question. He says, looking around for oh yeah. So this goes back to a video conversation I had with this guy, the author of this book, Dale Allison, and chapter 7. We discussed this very question, and the verses that are relevant to this question are, and this is the time as Jesus dies, according to Matthew, this happens. The earth shook, and the rocks were split, and the tombs were open, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city, that's Jerusalem, and they appeared to many people. And then there's a fascinating quote here, which I'll read. Tom Wright, by the way, is a leading evangelical biblical scholar, a Christian. Tom Wright wants to leave open the question of the historicity of Matthew's surreal episode. His rationale is this, quote, some stories are so odd that they may just have happened. This may be one of them, but in historical terms, there is no way of finding out, end quote. And then Dale Allison says, this is not much of an argument. Who would urge, with reference to the tale of Lot's wife being turned into a pillar of salt, that some stories are so odd that they may just have happened, and this may be one of them? Surely oddness suggests fiction far more often than it suggests non-fiction. And then he quotes, well, the reasons why people don't believe this story, to give you one reason here, the astounding, he's referring to the resurrection of all these saints, he says, has left no trace in the other Gospels, Acts, Paul, Josephus, or for that matter, for any other pre-Matthean source. It stands alone half a century or more after the incredible events it reports. And then this is the best argument of all. Yet the stupendous marvels depicted in Matthew 27, had they a firm grounding in known fact, would quickly have become a bedrock of Christian apologetics, especially as the text speaks of many saints and many witnesses. So this is surely true, because the most amazing miracle, therefore, in the whole of the New Testament would therefore be this story in Matthew 27, when a whole many saints came out of their tombs at the time of Jesus dying on the cross, and then they walked around and they went into Jerusalem and were seen by many people in Jerusalem. Wow. And this is Passover time, so you're going to have a lot of people there, and yet no one knows anything about it in any other historical source. But this would have been made. Can you imagine how people would have used this in evangelical or evangelistic mission, saying, look, when our Savior died on the cross, all these people came out of their tombs. Look, they're still around now. You can talk to them. And yet there's no trace in Acts or anywhere else that any Christian ever saw this as a great argument, a proof for the miraculous effects that Jesus' death on the cross had on physical nature when dead people actually came out of their tombs. It didn't happen. So we can tell both by an argument from silence, if you like, and arguments from silence can be good arguments sometimes, but also from the absence of any evidence in any other source that this is not historical. So now, why does this matter? It's just 2 verses in Matthew. Why it matters, and I put this to to one of the scholars, it matters because if Matthew can make stuff up about resurrection, about resurrection accounts, the resurrection of these people in Matthew 27, how can we trust him to tell the gospel truth, the historical facts about anything else, about the resurrection of Jesus? What it does is, once you allow that the gospel writers are prepared to make stuff up to give you fiction, not fact, it can, for me, it calls into question everything. How can you you can't just automatically trust them anymore. And that's why, as Dale Allison said when I asked him this, that's why we have biblical scholarship, because not everything in the Gospels is obviously true. So you have to try and go back and recover what is true from what is patently false. And that's why we have biblical scholarship. So this is a real problem. And people like, what is his name now? Michael Licona from Houston Baptist University, USA, who's mentioned on the back here, or writes a review on the back. A leading conservative evangelical scholar and apologist in the US, even he admits that this story of the mass rising of the dead is not true. It's not a factual story. So even evangelicals are beginning to get it. But this, I think, really can cause, can shake one's confidence that the Gospels are telling you the truth, if they're telling you lies. And a fiction is an invented story. It is a lie when you're trying to pass it off as history. And Matthew is passing it off as history. So there we go. That's my take on this. And this is a very interesting book, by the way. Dale Allison, as I say, he was a guest here yesterday, on Friday. If you want a good scholarly introduction to the whole issue of the alleged resurrection of Jesus, very good. What do we say about Arianism? Am I going to get this quickly? Yes, I am. What do you think about Arianism? Christians say that it was a heresy. Well, Christians at the time of Arius, before I explain who he is, for those who don't know, didn't think it was a heresy. They thought it was the truth. Arianism is a 3rd and 4th century, it was an umbrella term that covered a range of views, actually, that were broadly understood to suggest that God, the Father, was the only true uncreated God. And in some sense, the Son, although you could use divine language of him, you could call him God in some way, there was a time when he was not. This is a slogan that came allegedly from Arius. Who was Arius? He was a churchman, a theologian from Egypt. He argued against the view that was gaining strength associated with a guy called Athanasius. He argued against the view that Jesus was God, just like God. He's just God. Who's Jesus? He's God. No, says Arius, only the Father is truly God, the uncreated, eternal God. Arianism is the view that Jesus wasn't, although you could see him as divine in some way, in a secondary sense. Now, that view, Arianist view, was actually the conservative theology of the day. This was the view that had been traditionally in the churches in the generations before. The idea that Jesus was just God in that kind of simple way was shocking, because the New Testament doesn't say that. It's not what kind of... If you look at the Apostles' Creed, for example, it doesn't say Jesus is God. It's God the Father who is God. So it wasn't a heresy for many churchmen, even bishops. But for some, it was a heresy, like Athanasius, who was another Egyptian chap. And so the church battled against this. There's like an ecclesiastical civil war for generations. It didn't just end with the Council of Nicaea. Oh, the Council of Nicaea, by the way, was called by the Emperor Constantine in 325 AD in a place called Nicaea, which is today in Turkey. And he was aware, Constantine, the emperor, was aware of how a disuniting and subverting effect the church, this whole conflict in the church was having on his empire. And he wanted to bring unity and theological unity and agreement on this subject. So he called the Council of Nicaea. The bishops there had a vote, and most of them voted for Athanasius against Arius, against the Arian view, by majority vote. And those who disagreed with the emperor and Athanasius were exiled, and they knew they'd be exiled. So there's a great incentive to vote with the emperor on this. It wasn't exactly like a modern democracy. So it's this theology based on democratic vote with a heavy penalty if you didn't vote the right way. But they did vote the right way according to Constantine, and Jesus was declared God. But after that council, the church still was racked with conflict, and many bishops and priests and lay folks still maintain that Jesus was not God. Anyway, so I think Arianism is more, and I'm not the only one to say that Arianism is closer to the New Testament than Trinitarianism, or the idea that Jesus is God, in my opinion. Acts 2:22. Yes. How do Christians understand 2:22? Well, Acts 2:22. Well, again, Christians are not like in agreement about many things. So it depends which Christian you ask. So 2:22. This is Peter giving a great speech to the Israelites. This is after Pentecost, and he mentions Jesus. And I'll read it from. This is the NRSV, by the way. This is the translation most used as the gold standard in academia. So if you're a biblical scholar and you're working with an English translation, this is the one you use. So if you want a really good English translation that is reliable, as best as there are, this is the best. So that's why I use this translation. Of course, fundamentalists hate it because it's a different subject. So I'll mention 2:22. I don't want to misquote it because it's a very significant passage. So Jesus is addressing the Israelites, as I say, and he said this is after the ascension of Jesus, after Pentecost, the coming of the Holy Spirit, as they say. You that are Israelites, listen to what I have to say. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with deeds of power, wonders, and signs that God did through him among you, as you yourselves know. So that's that verse. So what is it saying? Well, Peter, I mean, I don't know if Peter actually said this, by the way, but according to Luke, he did. Peter is testifying to the Israelites that Jesus was just a man and that God did amazing things through him. God did amazing things through Moses, of course, as well, and through Muhammad and through many prophets of God. He's not saying, and it's what he doesn't say that's equally interesting, that Jesus is God incarnate, the second person of the Trinity, the divine Son of God, or anything like that. He says he's a man. attested to you by God, who's a separate being. This is God attesting the man, Jesus, that God did these amazing wonders and signs through him among you, as you yourselves know. So this is enormously interesting because it suggests a non-Trinitarian, Unitarian understanding of Jesus right at the beginning of the church. And Peter there is not preaching the Trinitarian theology of later centuries. So how do Christians understand it? Well, they would say, well, they do say, because I've obviously had this conversation at Speaker's Corner and elsewhere, they say, but look at John, and look at John's gospel, look at doubting Thomas, my Lord and my God. They'll immediately divert from that and go to other parts of the New Testament. So that they basically ignore it. That's what they do. They just ignore it. So what else can I say? Oh gosh, this is a big question. I'm not going to spend too long on this because it's a really big question. Can you explain about the Jewish concept of Messiah and the Islamic and Christian understanding of Jesus, peace be upon him, as Messiah? I'm just going to give a summary here because this is a complicated academic subject, and I could go into it, but I don't want. I'm not going to go into it in great detail here. Suffice it to say this, and again, this is not really my opinion. And what I'm trying to do here is to share with you what the scholars are saying. Rightly or wrongly, this is what historians broadly agree is the case. So I'm not giving you my personal whims here. This is what they say. So the very common view amongst historians, specialists in the era of Jewish understandings of the Messiah, is as follows. And this is a simplified explanation. That there are several different conceptualities of the Messiah to be found in Second Temple Judaism. So when the temple was destroyed, rebuilt, when the Jews came back from Babylon, it was rebuilt in the 5th century, 6th century. After that time, there were several different and distinct understandings of the role of the Messiah to be found in Judaism. So it wasn't like a single job description. How do we know this? Well, if we look, for example, at the different sources, if we look at our evidence, if we look, say, at the Dead Sea Scrolls, these were produced by the Qumran community in the Dead Sea, near the Dead Sea, in what is now occupied Palestine. We see that they were expecting at least two messiahs. They expected a priestly messiah and a prophetic messiah. So they expected two messiahs, or a kingly messiah. It's a little bit unclear, but there are at least two of them. Another popular conception found in the Jewish scriptures also is a figure like David, a king like David. So the Messiah is a king, a son of God, but understood in the sense that David is called a son of God in Psalm 2, for example, where the king David is addressed as son. Now this goes back to I think it's 1 Samuel 7:14, where you get this son, God addressing the king as son, and this became like a prototype for the king having this filial relationship with God, and that became a type of Messiah, which then became applicable at later times. And the idea of this understanding of Messiah as king, like David, that he would liberate the Jews from occupation, from this time from the Romans, and he would restore Israel to its sovereignty, where it would rule itself according to the laws of Moses, and the Messiah would be king and rule. And we find this kind of understanding in the Bar Kokhba revolt in the early 2nd century, a messianic figure who was acknowledged as the Messiah by many Jews, revolted against the Romans again, and he was successful for a while. The Romans then came in and they completely destroyed the Jewish state, the embryonic Jewish state then, and killed the Messiah and so on. He wasn't really the Messiah, he failed. And what's interesting that because of that political and religious crisis brought on by this destruction, some Jews had the brilliant idea of writing down the oral Torah, which is now called the Mishnah, And that plus the written Torah, what Christians call the first 5 books of the Old Testament, is together called the Talmud today. And this book, I recommend The Complete Idiot's Guide, because I was a complete idiot on this subject. If you want a really good introduction to the Talmud, by the way, Rabbi Aaron Parry, who's an American rabbi, this is an excellent introduction to the Talmud. That contains the Talmud. It contains rabbinic commentary on the Mishnah, the oral Torah, plus the first 5 books of Moses, and is the central focus of Jewish spiritual life today. So, well, there's a bit of a diversion. So, yeah, the kingly Messiah. Oh, and then another understanding is one that comes from Daniel to some extent. It's a heavenly Messiah, one like a son of man, if you think of Daniel 7. So it would be a figure who would come from the heavenly realms, who would bring to pass an apocalyptic revolution or change in the world state of affairs, and bring about a utopian society where there will be peace. And indeed, the other Messiah's objective is also not just to overthrow evil, but to establish peace in the world. And you see prophetic passages in Isaiah that talk about that. And some of these passages, like Isaiah 11, for example, you find on the lips of Jesus in Luke's gospel, where the story is Luke portrays Jesus going to a synagogue where Isaiah 11 is read out, which is a messianic passage in the Bible. And Jesus reads it out, by the way, this passage, and sits down and says, this passage has now come true, has now been fulfilled in your hearing. In other words, he is identifying himself with this messianic text. So so that's the Jewish thing. Okay, the Islamic and the Islamic is different. I think we have to say that and then of course the Christian understanding. Sorry, I should just briefly end this because we go on forever talking about this. In the Christian understanding, in say Paul, the Messiah is a heavenly figure who, as foretold in the scriptures, would die for the sins of the world and rise again on the 3rd day. He would conquer death, and he would bring his believers, his followers, into a new heavenly family, the people of God, this new Israel. Now, so the messianic conception there is completely different from any other Jewish understanding, because nowhere in Judaism before the rise of Christianity is there any evidence that any Jew ever expected the Messiah to die for people's sins and rise on the 3rd day. This expectation did not exist as far as we know. There's no evidence in history at all that anyone ever thought that. Any Jew expected that before the beginning of Christianity. Now, of course, Paul was a Jew, so he was one who did expect that. But before the rise of Christianity, no Jew, as far as we know, ever expected that to happen. So this is what Muslims call a bid'ah. This is an innovation, a new thing, unexpected, unconceived, and not testified before in any of the Jewish literature or scriptures that we know of, contrary to what Paul himself claims. And the Islamic understanding is similar to the Christian and the Jewish one. The Messiah, obviously, in Jesus is identified as the Messiah, called the Messiah in the Quran, of course, born of a Virgin Mary, sent only to the lost sheep and only to the people of Israel, which is what the Bible says in Mark 15, where Jesus says, according to Matthew 15, I am only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So the Quran agrees with that statement. He's just a human being. He's not a divine being. He's not a second person of the Trinity. He's not sent to die for the sins of the world. He preaches essentially the same message that Moses does, but with a particular emphasis on the themes that we see perhaps in the Gospels, stressing love and mercy and sincerity, and speaking of one who is to come. That's part of what he does as well. In other words, talking of the advent of the final prophet of God. And he will return, according to Muslim belief, at the end of time, the end of the ages. And he will fight the Antichrist and so on. And there are lots of stories about that, some of reliable, perhaps, and some not so reliable. So he's more like a king figure like in Judaism, I think, a prophet, rather than the Christian idea of a divine being who became incarnate as a human. That's not part of Islam, of course. So that's the end of that, because it's a lot to say. One could say so much more. So I'm just random questions, really. Is epilogue of John 21 a forgery? Don't think so. It doesn't claim to be. The last chapter of John's Gospel is a different narrator speaking about the preceding chapters, about the person who authored those chapters. I don't think it's a forgery. It's not making a false claim. It's not saying I am X and we know X to be a false claim. It's just it is what it is. Billy Hunter asks, is there a difference of hadith science in different sects of Islam, Sunni, Shia, Ibadis? Yes, actually there is. And I'm not going to go into it now because it's quite an academic subject. However, that very question is addressed at length. The Sunni, the Shia hadith collections, because it is distinct in some ways from the Sunni one, is discussed in here, and also other sects as well. So there is a difference. If you want a good, readable, modern introduction, this is my recommended reading. So hopefully that's dealt with that one. Question: to what extent should we use philosophy to argue for God and Islam? Whoa, this is a very controversial question. And because I'm not a scholar, I'm not going to give you any rulings or fatwas on this, but it is a controversial question historically, because if you look at the very earliest, if you look at the founders of the four madhabs, Hanbali, Hanafi, Maliki, and the Shafi, the founders, the eponymous founders themselves, were, I understand, were quite anti-kalam, kalam being the Arabic term for theology. And the criticism is, particularly from Salafis today, is that Greek philosophy was an alien intrusion into the early pure Sunni theology and epistemology, and should be rejected completely, regurgitated out, not acceptable. We can't use Greek philosophy, kalam, as it's called, borrowing the tools of Aristotle, for example, who was very popular amongst some Muslims, particularly the Mutazilites, the rationalists, and others, the Asharites as well, Maturidis. Someone like Al-Ghazali, who was a 12th century, died at 1111 AD, said he was very, very critical of people like Ibn Sina in the Arabic. These were philosophers, very prominent philosophers, very popular in the West, big influence on people like Thomas Aquinas, the Catholic theologian. He was very critical of them because they went into heresy, because the philosophical Hellenistic understanding so dominated their thinking as Muslims that they ended up rejecting key Islamic teachings clearly taught in the Quran. For example, the resurrection of the body, for example. So Al-Ghazali wrote a book against the philosophers. I have a copy of it behind me. Is it called Against the Philosophers? Let me just get it. Oh, God knows. No, it's not. It's in another room where the rest of my books are. Sorry. Basically refuting these guys, but nevertheless retaining some of the apparatus, the conceptual apparatus of Greek philosophy. Someone like Ibn Taymiyyah, famously, who came a bit later, completely rejected Greek philosophy or using philosophy, although he himself used philosophical arguments, actually, in his disputations with other people. So this is a really, really controversial subject, and I'm not qualified, way above my pay grade, to adjudicate on this. But my sympathies lie with those who put a question against a kind of unrestricted use of this philosophy, because I've seen what it did to Christianity in the early church. People like Justin Martyr and others, who was a philosopher, who was a Greek philosopher before he became a Christian, basically imported into Christian theology a lot of Greek metaphysics, pagan metaphysics. So did St. Augustine in the 5th century, a big fan of Plato. You can see a lot of his theology is heavily Platonized, influenced by the 5th century BC man Plato, who knew Aristotle, of course. And then when you get to someone like Thomas Aquinas, the very distinguished medieval theologian, actually contemporary of Ibn Taymiyyah, amazingly, they actually lived at the same time. These two titans lived at the same time. Thomas Aquinas was hugely influenced by the philosopher. Who was this? Aristotle. So his language of transubstantiation, this is when the bread and the wine become the body and blood of Christ at the Eucharist. This language that he used, transubstantiation, directly the language of substance, is directly taken from Aristotle. Now, Aristotle was not a Christian, he was not a Jew, he was a pagan. And so he, as well, imported a lot of pagan concepts and theologies into the expression of his faith. The church accepted this, didn't it? At first, by the way, he was rebuked and suffered chastisement from the authorities in the University of Paris for his views, but they were actually accepted ultimately. And now he is probably the greatest Catholic theologian of all time, perhaps along with St. Augustine. So it does matter. It changes the religion. If you drink in lots of pagan philosophy, it does change you. It does change the religion. And so I have a sympathy with those who question whether or not we should use philosophy in Islam, because it will change the religion. But again, I'm open to be educated on this. That's just my personal opinion. So just looking through some questions here. There are lots of arguments going on as well as questions. How reliable? Okay, I'm picking on the ones that I can find that I can answer. How reliable is the Gospel of Thomas? Well, it depends really. There are some scholars, for example, Dominic Crossan, who had the privilege of interviewing, I don't know, was it a month ago now, professor in America at he actually says a lot of Thomas is reliable, and it goes back even earlier than the Gospels we have today, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, most scholars have not followed him in this, to be honest. Most scholars would see the Gospel of Thomas as containing authentic material because it resembles the synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. A lot of it does, but some of it doesn't. Some of it is clearly Gnostic. Gnostic in its theology. And it talks in a very, very negative way about women, and has views which are really strange if you're unfamiliar with it. So probably some of it is reliable. Probably some of it is heavily influenced by Gnostic 2nd century views. So it's the gospel we have today is probably a composite of several different kind of sources. But there you go. The scholars are not all agreed on its dating, how much of it was authentic, etc. So you take your pick, really. Do you think Christianity is true? If so, what category it belongs? For example, Roman Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, Evangelical, etc. Do I think Christianity is true? Yes, it is largely true. Let me explain what I mean. Christianity says there is one God. It says Jesus is the Messiah. It says Moses was the prophet sent to Israel who gave them the law, the Torah. It says there will be a day of judgment. It says there is heaven and hell. It says there are angels. It says there are demons. It says the dead, there will come a day when the dead will be resurrected. It says so much that Muslims, by the way, accept. But, like an iceberg, most of what traditional Christians, I'm not talking about extreme liberals or skeptics, most of what traditional Christians believe is perfectly acceptable, I think, to Muslims and to many Jews, actually. The dispute is about that smaller amount, really important, but smaller amount. Who is Jesus? Is God, who may be one, but is he three persons in one? How are we saved? So are we saved by following Jesus, believing his death and resurrection, as Paul claims, or are we saved do we enter into paradise by the mercy of God? And our works, our faith and works, are also very important. So, you know, the interesting thing about this question, which category, Roman Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, what is often not realized is this, is that all of these denominations, these churches that you've listed, actually can be traced back, their theology, to Paul, in the New Testament. They all accept Paul. They all accept the New Testament we have today. But historically, there were other Christian groups, churches, denominations, some of which exist, some of which are now extinct, like, for example, the Ebionites of the 2nd century and the 1st century, who would not accept Paul as an apostle. They would see him as a heretic or an apostate, someone who abandoned the Jewish faith. And they would reject his idea of a dying and rising savior God that Paul pronounced on. So what we have today, it looks like we have lots of really different Christian churches, but actually they all share a similar adherence ultimately to the theology of Paul, because it's in their New Testament. But in the early centuries, there were Christianities, and there were many Christians who rejected Paul and had a different scriptures, different understanding of Jesus, different understanding of how to get to heaven. And some of those understandings are very similar to Islamic understandings. So that's probably all I can say on that for the moment, without boring you all silly. So let me just get some water. Pausing here. So just looking for any questions that might be relevant to anything at all that we're talking about. Was the Torah lost after the era of Prophet Solomon, and for how long? I don't know. The consensus, if there is such a thing, I suppose, today amongst historians, whether it be Christian historians or Jewish historians, is that the Torah we have today, that, by the way, I mean the first 5 books of Moses. I don't mean the Torah can have a narrower definition, the first 5 books of Moses. It can have a broader definition, the entire the prophets as well, and even the writings, and it can have an even bigger definition in the sense of the oral and written Torah, which Orthodox Jews believe in as well. So Torah can mean different things. I assume you mean the first 5 books of Moses in the written sense. So the consensus view here is that the Torah we have today in existence goes back in its current form to when the Jews came back from exile in Babylon in the 6th century, and they came back to Jerusalem. And the argument is that the Genesis and Deuteronomy, Leviticus, and Numbers, Exodus are compiled at that time from much older traditions and some new material as well. So Genesis, for example, looks like a composite work. You can tell if you read the Hebrew, and I can't, so I'm relying on other people, that the language is probably made up of different authors. The writing style differs. You get anachronisms, so you get place names, for example, that are mentioned in Genesis that were only called that much later, say in the 5th century BC or the 6th century BC. This suggests that the narrative was written at that time rather than, say, by Moses, 1,800 years BC, whatever date you have for Moses. So it could be that the Torah, some of the Torah survived, I don't know what, but then was incorporated in a new kind of Bible that was produced, as I say, when the Jews came back from Babylon. That's kind of what most scholars today think. Beyond that, I can't say, as I'm not a scholar. So, what do I think about evolution? What do I think? I mean, what do I know? I'm not a scientist. My personal view, for what it's worth, and it's worth very little, is that I believe that however it happened, the species we have, the human beings we have, God did it. And that I do actually believe in intelligent design. I didn't for a long, long time. It's only the last few years I've changed my mind on this. I believe that what we're discovering now at the level of molecular machinery, of the cells, the way that cells are constructed, there's incredible factories of great complexity and sophistication, and the machinery, the biological machinery you can see at work, really suggests design. I mean, it does just suggest. So the idea of Darwinian survival of the fittest as the motor for generating new species over time is clearly, in my personal ignorant opinion, completely inadequate as a tool for an explanation. We're looking at we've got to look for other explanations, and I think intelligent design's got to be the right way to go forward. But you know, I don't. I'm not a scientist, so. A lot of spamming going on in the questions, I'm afraid to say. So I'm just going to pick some random. Are the Gospels actually anonymous? So why are their names of the Gospels like Matthew, Mark? Very, very good question. The answer is yes, they are anonymous. If you read the Gospels, here's a Bible. Go and read the Gospels. If you look at the Gospel, if you read it, verse 1 onwards, it doesn't say who wrote them. Interesting. Now, I know at the beginning that we've added the Gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but these titles, according to historians, were added in the 2nd century. They're not part of the original text. And Matthew, for example, the first one, I'm going to stop here because we have a guest. I'm incredibly happy to say we have a guest, folks. Salam alaikum, brother. Can you hear me? He can't hear me yet. Anyway, this is Dr. Harun Sidat, who can't hear me, but I'll also carry on talking, who I know. We've not had the pleasure of meeting yet. I've not had the privilege of meeting him, but he is a British academic, a real academic associated with University of Bristol here in England, and is a published author. He's writing work for the University of Oxford as we speak. I mean, he might mention that. I don't think he can hear me. Hello. I've got to know him through online, and we're in contact. And hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry.
Wonderful. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Paul.
Welcome. You're most welcome, sir. I'm so pleased. I invited you earlier. I know you have a very busy private life at the moment with things going on, and so I'm very happy indeed that you're here. This is not a particularly scheduled meeting. I just invited you on because I want just to introduce you to the viewers who watch Blogging Theology. I just said very briefly who you were. I'll just repeat it because I might have got it wrong. I said you are a British academic. You're Muslim, obviously. We can see you are Muslim. No, but you're a British academic with a PhD, and you are a published author, and you're writing for Oxford University Press, and you're associated with the University of Bristol.
Cardiff.
Oh, so I knew it.
So it's okay. It's not far apart.
Yeah, I guess they're not too far apart. Southwest England. And you are I know this. You are a prodigious researcher, reader, scholar. Talk about industrious. You are very focused in your work, and it's very impressive. And welcome to Blogging Theology. Would you like to say more about who you are, if that's all right, and what you're about as a?
Okay. So yeah, I mean, you probably tick most of the boxes. I do try to be a good imam. I'm an imam in a mosque, small mosque. So that's something that I do as well. And then I have my family, which is what you've touched upon, which is my 3 children who keep me awfully busy. And I do try and squeeze in some reading when I can, and writing when I can, and some lecturing when I can. So yeah, that's who I am. I work for Cardiff University. We have a center there called the Center for the Study of Islam in Britain. So we look at Islam in Britain in particular. That's our focus. But I actually live in the north of England. That's where I actually live. But I'm very much, I'd like to say, plugged in to the Muslim community. So, I'm aware of what's going on in the community, I hope. And I'm also, I should say, I've also studied traditionally I've studied the classic Islamic studies syllabus, which is my first studies really after I completed my GCSE education. So I memorized the Quran at a very young age. In our tradition, sort of in my family, it's sort of like it's a thing that you must do. You must memorize the Quran. So my father said, in fact, for my father, I wouldn't really be a son in his eyes, perhaps, if I hadn't memorized the Quran. So there was a bit of pressure there.
Wow.
But I've seen the wisdom of that now. You can recall verses instantly. In Arabic. So I did that, and then I studied, learned the Arabic language, 7th century classical Arabic, if you like. And I'm very much, that's my fascination. The classic, what we call the Turath, the inherited tradition that Muslims pass on. So yeah, that's about it, really.
Well, not really, because you went on to do a PhD. And what was that about?
Yeah, so before I did my PhD, I also did a degree in economics, and social studies. So I have a background in economics and finance and accounting as well. I have a background in education as well, in MA. And then my PhD was at Cardiff. I was on a scholarship, basically. And my focus was on the formation and training of the ulama. The ulama are basically what we'd call the religious scholars. So in Britain, so we know there are many seminaries, which is a Christian equivalent, though not the same thing. In Britain, there are many, and many of them have tradition. Their tradition goes back to, or their history goes back to South Asia, India in particular, and we're talking about colonial India as well. Actually, if you go further back, then all the way back through Mughal India, so they have a very rich tradition. So these seminaries are very well established in the UK now, and they don't just produce imams; they produce a whole array of graduates. Some of them do become imams, but a lot of them do go into other fields as well. And so I studied in one for 7 years. And then I went out, did my degree, and did various other things. And then I came back as a researcher to research what's called ethnography. So ethnography, basically, you go in and you try and chart what it's like being, in that particular field. So in this case, a Darul Ulum, a seminary. So I kind of like chart the daily rhythms. I ask questions about why people would come there. Why would a young Muslim, second generation, third generation Muslim, even contemplate going to study the classic Islamic tradition when there's no career prospects ostensibly when you do one of these subjects? But why are these places so in demand? Why are so many Muslims sending their children? Then why are so many young children wanting to study the Islamic tradition, right? And so I asked that question. Then I look at what's life like in one. There's a lot of misunderstanding, as you can imagine, about these places, as there is generally about Islam generally. So, and then I asked a question around what do people do once they leave these places? So traditionally, you'd work for the government, right? If you were in a Muslim state, if you were in the Ottoman Empire or the Mughal Empire, you'd become what we would call a civil servant. Or you'd become a mufti, or you'd work in the legal field, for example. But we don't have all of that anymore. So what do these people do? And so I was asking the question about what they do. But also, what I was also trying to do is I was trying to chart my own experience, because there'd been a gap of 10 years of when I studied at one and when I come back as a researcher. And in those 10 years, this place has changed quite a lot.
Oh, really?
And I've changed myself reflexively, but the place itself has changed quite a lot. And so the challenge then is, as you know, Paul, I mean, people always talk about Muslims being, Muslims need to get, catch up with the game and become liberal and open-minded and everything else. And so one of the questions I ask is, on their terms, right? On their terms, how have they progressed, rather than looking at what other people think they should have progressed, in what ways they should have progressed. So that's basically some of the research I did. Yeah.
I mean, it's quite shocking. When I spoke to, I was quite shocked when I spoke to Professor Dale Allison yesterday, who is a professor at a seminary at Princeton Seminary. And what he is teaching, I mean, it's not my place to judge him, but I'm saying that, you're not going to come away with a robust Christian faith, I wouldn't have thought, having sat at his feet for 3 or 4 years. You're going to come away with a confused, complex, questioning, doubting faith, I would think. And he is representative. He's far from being idiosyncratic. But I get the impression that the places you've studied, you're trying to bring people into the tradition itself, the Islamic tradition, in an affirmative way, over against the powerful influence of the zeitgeist in the West, in Britain, which requires Muslims to change fundamentally their religion in all sorts of areas, gender relations, sexuality, all sorts of ways. But it's quite different there, isn't it? There's a more of hopefully a more of a robust attempt to create an enduring tradition rather than conform to the zeitgeist and the Daily Mail and the BBC and Macron or whatever. That's not quite how you're doing things. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, these places are what we would call confessional, if you want to use a Western term again. So people go there not to criticize their faith, but to understand their faith in a much more deeper and profound way. So, it's very much like the liberal arts tradition in the West, where people would study grammar really well, logic really well, rhetoric really well. In fact, these are the same sciences that you study in the seminary, and they have same roots, the Aristotelian tradition as well. So they have, and there's a lot of overlap between these traditions. So, I mean, you can't really, talk about your faith if you don't know your faith well enough yourself, right? So you need to understand. So you need to understand in depth, or at least have a sufficient understanding of Arabic, which is the language that allows you to unlock the tradition, right? And then of course you then study many other sciences. So in the early years, you study what's called the auxiliary sciences, which are rhetoric, logic, the language, because you need to know them quite well to be able to understand when you read the hadith, right? When you read a tradition of the Prophet, or you read a verse from the Quran, what does it mean? Does it have a general application? Is it an exception to the rule? And so you have all of these like really complex hermeneutics that you have to be sort of really aware of to be able to understand the text, because you don't, of course, take the text literally. Of course, that's another separate discussion. So yes, you go there primarily to learn the tradition, which has been passed on, right? So we have what's called the Isnad system. So the Isnad system would be my teachers have studied from someone all the way back to the Prophet, peace be upon himself. So I can literally trace my tradition across geography, but also across time. So it collapses time almost to the Prophet himself. And this, of course,
kind of that's a certification.
Sorry, Paul, you broke up. Sorry,
we've lost. Yeah, the volume. Is that called an ijaza or something? Where this accreditation?
Yeah, that's right. It's a form of accreditation. Yeah.
And you have that yourself, do you?
So you have an accreditation, which in some ways, I hate to use the word authority, but it gives you, it's a form of verification that this person has studied Islam properly, according to a traditional method. So it's a very strong way of making sure that the tradition is passed on as authentically as possible. So it's also about, a lot of it's also about conservation of the tradition, right? How do we conserve that pristine moment in 7th century Arabia when revelation came to the Prophet and Islam was very much opening up, its vista was opening up, and so how do we maintain that in the 21st century context? But how do you then also engage with that, right? Because you can't take everything literally. So what principles, what values, what ethics, what morality can you take from that? And what rootedness can you have? And then make sense of that living in, for example, in modern Britain. That's really the challenge, I think, for a lot of people.
Okay, I slightly abrupt, maybe even impertinent thing. Can I just throw this question at you, because we are on a live stream Q&A? Brother Ball, can you ask about Gog and Magog, please? Hadith regarding it. I know very little about this at all. Is this something you have could address? Or
I mean, this is mentioned in the Quran. So Allah mentions in the Quran the verse Inna Ya'juja wa Ma'juja mufsiduna fil ard. So this is about this is in Surah Kahf, which is right in the middle of the Quran, if you like. And so God does mention about them historically, that they were causing what's called fasad. They were causing fitna or corruption on the earth. And so I think it was Khidr who was approached, and he built what's called like a dam to keep them away. And then you find prophetic reports that talk about how they will re-emerge at a certain point in the future, and they will continue, or they will consume or destroy resources on the planet. And then you can imagine, Paul, this can, this lets the imagination loose in many ways. Is it like two creatures, or is it like a group of people, or what are they, right? And so you have this whole tradition that emerges afterwards, after the Quran. So the Quran doesn't really go into the detail about them. It just tells you that they exist, they did exist, and then you look in the tradition of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and then you try and make sense. What I should say is, when it comes to a lot of these, this is just my personal view after reading a lot of this stuff, a lot of these things to do with end of times are usually, we don't like base our faith on them. They're not, in terms of epistemology, a lot of them will have questionable chains of authority in terms of the hadith itself, or when you put, because you never take a hadith in isolation, you always put them together and say, well, it's a bit like detective work. You put all the evidences together. And I think, sorry to go off on a tangent here, Paul, I think this is important. When people study hadith, what the way I look at it, they like snapshots. So they like a picture taken at a point in history. They can mean literally anything, because it's just a picture of the Prophet.
And with no context, there's no historical context.
No.
They're just little snapshots, if you like. So
that's right. That's right. And you'll find many authentic hadiths that are not acted upon today, right? They're not there they're basically data, if you want to use a modern jargon. They're data. And what you have is the scholars who are experts in this field. They collect all the hadiths, they amalgamate them, and they say, oh, this is our rating, this is what we think of this one, and they put them all together. Then you have another group of scholars who then come along and say, okay, we need to make sense of this. So it actually goes through a filter process, which is what's called a fuqaha, usually the jurists, because they have the juridical mindset. And so they will then have, and each schools of law will have their own hermeneutical filter, which they will put it through and say, well, this is what we think based on our hermeneutics, what this hadith means, or what this particular topic means. They won't really say things like, Paul, they won't say stuff like this hadith means this. What they will say, this topic, this is how we understand this topic, this particular genre. So I'm going off on a tangent, but I think it's important for people to know that you don't just take a hadith in isolation. I mean, they're virtuous to read and you can benefit from, but
you get Christian missionaries who will throw a hadith, just a solitary bit of data at a Muslim and say, deal with that, But this is incredibly, a cretinous, stupid way to do it, because that's not how hadiths are understood, or they're not integrated and understood in a wider context. It's a system of thought. There's no nuance, and so no, absolutely, I get that. Just to throw another question, almost randomly, what do you think of? Well, what do you think?
Definitely benefit from him. CMC in Cambridge, I mean, scholar. He's learned the tradition. He knows the British tradition. Even he knows the context very well. If it was me, I would definitely read. I mean, I've read his works. I do read his works. But like any scholar, you can have points of criticism and agreement, disagreement. But he's definitely an asset to the British Muslim community, if not to the British community itself, to be honest.
And the other question, sorry, I'm not jumping onto this question quite yet. Coming back to Tim Winter, have you read his most recent book on traveling home?
I have. I haven't read the entire book, but I've read chapters, because it's a collection of speeches and essays that he's written in the past. It's very good, actually.
Very stimulating. Did you watch the video "Aliens in the Quran"? No, I didn't. What's the opinion? I never even heard of this video, so maybe we need to watch it. I didn't know there were aliens in the Quran. That's news to me.
Okay.
What else have we got? Got any more questions for our esteemed guest? There's a lot of spamming going on here as well, unfortunately. We don't have a moderator, which is probably my fault. Thinking I could do it all, but I can't. It's too much. And Gog and Magog be jinns? I have no idea.
I have no idea. There's this fascination, Paul, with like all of this sort of stuff. I think I blame the sci-fi genre. People are just fascinated with end of times, and it's a good way of attracting crowds at mosques, I believe.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Just talk about this sort of stuff, you know.
I didn't know.
But I always say to people, I'm quite a back to basics guy. So I'm always like, look, let's go back to basics. What does the Quran actually tell you? What you need to know to get salvation? And you'll find a lot of people don't know that. If you ask a question, I mean, you can do a poll. Paul, what does the Quran actually say?
I'm going to ask you that question. What does the Quran say about salvation? No, seriously.
Look, it's simple. Three things for me come when I read the Quran. I always look at it as God's talking to me directly as a mirror. Right. So it's telling me things I don't like to hear, but I need to hear it. That's the way I look at the Quran, because the primary audience for me is me. So when God talks about Pharaoh or the devil, or when he talks about paradise, or you know the various conversations that are taking place in the Quran, I kind of like situate myself in there because I believe God's talking to me directly. Yep. In terms of salvation, in terms of the three things that I think Quran talks about time and time again, and the beautiful thing about the Quran, Paul, is that it does it in different ways, so it appeals to people in different ways. One of them is very simple, which is Tawheed, which is this idea that there's one God, and he has no father, mother, you know, that sort of stuff, none of that. And it's very simple. This is God. He can do whatever he wishes. And then everything else stems out from that. So and God talks about that all the time, right? Don't associate partners. There's one God. Don't worship anything besides God or anyone besides God. That's the number one thing. The second thing God talks about is the prophet, finality of the prophet, right? That the Prophet Muhammad is the final prophet. There were prophets that came to humankind. Some we know about, some we don't know about. That's not the point. The point is that they came. The point is that they tried to convince people to seek salvation. Some responded, some didn't respond, and they had their own challenges, like every other human being goes through. And that's God's mercy that He sent a human being like us, very much, to help us to gain ultimate salvation. So this is very, very important. The Quran talks about this time and time again, and the lessons we can draw. And the third thing is really eschatology, which is the study of what we call the akhirah, the world to come. The dunya is, in Arabic, the word dunya is dana. Dana means something that's immediate to you, something that's very close to you, which is the dunya. Like it's material, you can see it in front of you. The akhirah is what's to follow afterwards. Ukhra, as we say in Arabic, is to follow later. So God's reminding us that, you know, it's almost like when God talks about in the Quran, He's not even trying to convince you. He's just telling you it's happening. This is it. This is like, whether you want to believe it or not, it doesn't make a difference. It's going to happen. It's an ontological reality, if you like. And so God says, look, you're all going to die, and you're all going to be resurrected, and you're all going to be asked about what you did with your life, the opportunity that you had, the gift of life that you were given. And God's given you many gifts. How did you use it? And the ultimate kufr, if you like, the ultimate being an act of being ungrateful, is that you use what God gave you in a way that it was never meant to be used. Because God gives you all of these things to be used in a way that seeks His pleasure, but to use it in an improper way is an ultimate form of kufr. It's like you're just being ungrateful. And so God's going to ask you. And Allah says in the Quran, for example, وَإِن تَعُدُّوا نِعْمَةَ اللَّهِ لَا تُحْصُوهَا, that if you try to enumerate the gifts of God, the ni'mah that He gave you, you're not going to be able to count them. But God talks about the life to come as though it's real. It's going to happen. And in places in the Quran, God is very, very descriptive about what's going to happen. Right. And I know a lot of people find there's a lot of sensibilities around, like, why would God describe things in such a way? But because it's to remind you that this is going to happen. It's not like you have a choice, right? And so when you will see it, as Allah mentions in the Quran, with your eyes, and you'll see it as it's a real thing for you, right? Then you'll realize. So God promises paradise, eternal paradise for people as well. So these are the three things: the oneness of God, the Tawheed or divine unity, prophethood, and the concept of eschatology or divine recompense, or whatever else you want to call it. These are the three key things, and then everything else sort of works its way around it.
Can I just say, Mohammed in Coventry, I have sent you the link for you to be a moderator. Thanks for offering to do that. I've sent you a link on the Twitter Messenger. So if you could just click on the link there, you'll be able to do that. Thank you very much for offering. Hope you're getting this. So that's quite a distinctive answer. So what's the relationship between doing good works, which are required in Islam? It's a kind of a Christian-y question, in a way. Relationship between good works and successful entrance into paradise. Do you need to do good works? Are they fundamental? Is that the way, you know, you earn your way into paradise? Is that what Islam teaches?
Well, good question. I think the Quran is clear. It says belief and good actions. وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ. And it's not just one place. Time and time again, when you read the Quran, Allah says have belief, which is the entrance into faith, and perform righteous actions. So yes, you get into paradise, scholars would say, just through belief, right? But if you want to really, you know, get to the top, like anything else in the world, then you've got to perform righteous actions, which is the amal. So that's a very simple answer, I guess, without getting into all the sort of, you know, the theology of it all. So yeah, righteous actions are good. The more you do in this world, the more you're going to get in the life to come.
You just said the scholars say belief is the passport to paradise ultimately.
Yeah.
Is that what you said?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And there's a Bukhari hadith, I think, which says that. But you know, if you believe the oneness of God, Tawhid, is that the crucial thing one has to believe? Do you think?
Yeah, that's absolutely essential. I mean, after Islam, most scholars would say Islam is the final religion. اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم وأتممت عليكم نعمتي ورضيت لكم الإسلام. I know we're going to have a separate discussion at some point in the future on this particular topic, but the Quran does say that ikmal, that it's been completed. Islam is a complete religion. This verse came towards the end of the Prophet's life on this planet as well. So yeah, belief is what gives you the passport, i.e. you become part of the community, if you like, and then you perform righteous action, just like the companions did. You know, after they had belief, they just continued working towards righteous actions. And
but doesn't Islam also say that there can be a period, you know, if you're a particularly egregious sinner in this life, although you believe in Tawhid, there could be a time you will be required to spend a time in hell, which is a kind of a purgatory, because ultimately you will be admitted into paradise. So it's not like an automatic passport, you go straight to heaven. It can be a time of purification and so on required.
That's right, Paul. That is right. Yeah, that is. I mean, it's not. It doesn't mean like, you know, you get a free ride straight into paradise just by believing. You know, there will be, like you said, purgatory, if you want to use that word. There will be a time when people will need to cleanse themselves, if you like, or be cleansed rather. But nobody really wants. You know, you don't want to be there. You don't want to be in that position. And there's no disgrace in scraping into paradise. I mean, I know Londoners will. I always give this example. There's a verse in the Quran. Allah says, "فَمَنْ زُحْزِحَ عَنِ النَّارِ وَأُدْخِلَ الْجَنَّةَ فَقَدْ فَازَ." Like if you literally save yourself from the fire of Jahannam and you're made to enter paradise, like you've literally just got into paradise as the doors are shutting, like on the London Underground, right? Mind the doors, the doors are shutting. You know, you've been successful. God says you've been successful. فَقَدْ فَازَ.
You're in your. But where does it say that in the Quran? Do you happen to?
I'll get a reference for you. I can't remember exactly where it's in the Quran.
I'd be interested to. We, by the way, folks, we do have a moderator. Thank you, Mohammed from Coventry, for cleaning up the mess that was in the comments. So grateful for that service. Thank you so much. You know, the questions here, I don't even know what they mean. I mean, do you understand that question?
What does the doctor think about the? I think he's talking about some scholar in Pakistan who I don't really know much about, to be honest.
Okay, fair enough. We'll go there. Yeah. Someone saying salam to you, which is excellent.
Paul, I must say I need to go in a few minutes, but
okay. Well, in that case, thank you very much for your introduction. I mean, we are, God willing, scheduled to meet again maybe next week and talk in a more academic way about. I'm particularly interested in your subject of your PhD and the idea of secularization and how that affects Muslims and so on. So maybe we'll see you again next week, God willing.
Thank you.
So you know, do go if you have to.
I'm going to say thank you to everybody and salam and peace to everyone, and please benefit, and always happy to help where I can.
Excellent. Well, take care, brother. We'll see you soon.
Take care.
Salam.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Salam.
Well, that was a very pleasant surprise. I'm so pleased he came on. I had invited him a while ago. He's got a family function on at the moment, so very kind of him to take some time out to talk with us. So we've been live now for nearly 2 hours. So I think we might draw it to a close shortly. And so, are there any other questions or points people want to make that oh, I like this one. How this one I like. How important are gender roles in Islam? Now, asking me, well, maybe the scholar should answer this. I'm not a scholar, but this is very important, shall we say. I think, in my personal view, in the West, the emphasis is on the similarity or even identity of male and female roles. And gender, being male or female, in my view, is seen as a social construct in the West, and that's how that language it's used. So there's nothing intrinsic, there's nothing innate in a biological human's makeup which makes them male or female. So this would argue. It's kind of like what's called the blank slate understanding of human nature, that we come into this world without any intrinsic nature at all. And I think this is balderdash, and I'm not sure there's any science to back it up either. Islam rejoices and emphasizes the differences, I think, between between men and women, and rightly so. In our world, which values diversity, you'd think that this would be acknowledged, but it's not. It's the alleged interchangeability between male and female. So, a woman can do any job that a man can do. There's no such thing as motherhood or fatherhood. This is just, all this is, in my opinion, is degeneracy and really dangerous stuff. And I hope we come out of this madness in the West anyway, in Britain, France, America, elsewhere in the Western Europe, sooner rather than later, because it is harming people. It's harming children who are not given strong role models, I would argue, of fatherhood if you're a boy, or motherhood if you're a girl. And it's also, I think, very unfair on women who are, basically required to be men, because to do men's jobs, which, I mean, if there are differences between the genders, which I believe there are, then, women tend to be more to gravitate towards certain vocations, and men tend to gravitate towards a different kind of set of vocations. And I think those differences are innate. They're part of our DNA. They're part of our God-given fitra. And the Quran says the male is not like the female, or is different from the female. And I think the Quran's absolutely right. And traditional societies, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, or any societies have known this and emphasized it. And now we're losing that, or have lost it now in the West. And this is a tragedy, in my view. And people are paying the price. Women are many women are stressed out. They're having to raise children, if they have children, and have jobs as well, and they have to cope with all. This is a crazy world we live in the West anyway. And Islam, I think, is, and maybe some traditional Christians and some traditional Jews are still holding on to a more healthy, a more normal set of values, which affirm the distinctive differences between male and female, and their different roles. Islam has a different understanding of the roles between men and women, celebrates motherhood, celebrates a woman being the head of the household, looking after her children, looking after the husband's children, and the man is primarily the man who goes out into the world and earns the living. And this is actually a traditional, healthy way of ordering the family and work and society. And I personally think it's a great contribution that Islam can make to our world to keep this alive, this normalcy, this sense of the distinctivenesses of the genders and their roles. That's just my view anyway. So just looking at more questions, if there are any, before I go and have some dinner. I'm hungry. This is a curious question. Why do we have to believe in Allah, or, well, God in English? Well, because he made the universe, he made us. There's plenty of evidence for that. And the signs of the universe, whenever science looks through the telescope or looks at the incredibly small, the micro, we see design, we see order, we see beauty, we see exquisite design, and believing in God is the natural and obvious explanation. And if we don't believe in him, we're going to miss out on the purpose of life, I think, which is to seek the truth and be successful in this life and in the life after this life, because there is a life beyond this life. This is not a good question. Why are some Christians stubborn? Well, why are some Muslims stubborn? Why are some Jews stubborn? Because people are people, and that's just the way it is. What is Salam, what are your thoughts on the Pride Month that's going on? Well, I think my views tend to be quite traditional. I believe in traditional morality, whether it be in gender relations or sexual morality. So the idea of celebrating alternative sexualities and behaviors, I think, is from that traditional point of view, is completely not on. And we're living in a strange time when we are required to give our approval of these things. And I think many people quietly don't approve, and because of religious reasons or even because of other reasons. And it's a kind of like a new liberal fascism when we've all got to doff the cap and say, oh, how wonderful. And if you don't, then you're chastised. Or so I'm not a great fan, I must say. Do I believe in homosexuality? What do you mean, do I believe in it? All I can say is, someone asked me, what do I feel about it? It doesn't really matter what I think. What matters is what God has said. That's all that matters. My opinion may change from day to day. A man's opinion is uncertain often and is often usually wrong. So what matters is what God has said. So what has God said in his revelation? So I would point you to that answer rather than the beliefs of any human being who, as I say, we usually get things wrong. But God knows best. Why? Because he made us the way we are. So he's going to give us the information about any subject, whether it be homosexuality or gender relations or anything else for that matter. So I will point you in that direction rather than asking me my opinion. Who cares what I think? It's what God has said that matters. And I do point to God for the answer, not my own feelings, whatever they may be. So there we go. Looking for more. There's a question there. I refer to God as him. Blast. There's so many questions that come through and I can't find it now. There we go. Ooh. Is that it? Ah, yes. You refer to God as him. Yes, I did. So you mean God has a gender? No, I don't. It's a convention of the English language. In the English language, we have 3 genders. We have male, female, and neuter. If I refer to God as it in English, that means that God is an inanimate object without it's like a rock or a tree. So in English, we only have 2 genders left, and the tradition is we have to use a pronoun that is a personal pronoun for God, because that's the language we have. I understand, and I am willing to be corrected on this, in Arabic it's the same thing. God is referred to in the masculine pronoun in Arabic. That's not because theologians, Muslim think God is male. It's because that is the nature of the Arabic. So it's just a pronoun. It doesn't mean, see, unlike in Christianity, where God is male, literally male, he has a male blah, 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 because they believe Jesus is God. So this is a problem for Christians. But in Islam, God is genderless. He has no gender. Because of our human language, in some of our languages, we have to use gendered language. Otherwise, we couldn't speak about God at all. So I think that would be my answer. But again, I'm not a scholar. God knows best. Did Muhammad, peace upon him, is he mentioned in the Bible? I've done a video on this. If you go to Blogging Theology, it was kind of an ad hoc thing. I wasn't prepared to do it, but I gave my view on Isaiah 42, which Muslims believe speaks of Muhammad. I refer you to that video. The issues are quite complicated and I'm getting a bit tired now. So I'm going to offload that to the video I did. So yeah, my answer is yes and no. So I have my cake and eat it. I say no in one sense, yes in another way. I'm not saying you should all follow my views, but that's my answer. So yes and no. Muhammad is not mentioned in the Bible. Well, I can actually there is an argument to say that he is, and I present that view and that argument in the video. So I'm not happy with the view that says absolutely no mention. I think there is, but in the way that I define it. So I'll let you watch the video on that. Why Islam allows sex slaves? Well, Islam doesn't allow for sex slaves. That's a bit of a myth. I'm not going to go into this whole issue now because it's complicated and I'm a bit knackered. However, I do recommend a book. He says, looking for it. No, that's not it. Islam and slavery. Oh, I can't. I'm too tired to go and look for it. It's called Islam and Slavery by Professor Jonathan A.C. Brown, which I've read. It talks about the issue of slavery in Islam, obviously, and other kinds of slavery and the whole language of slavery and what's really going on in Islam. That this is a subject that is much misunderstood in the West, and the Islamic understanding of so-called slavery is very different from the archetypal Western understanding, which is quite influenced by the experience of black racist slavery in the United States, in the southern states, in the US. And of course, the American Civil War was fought over this very issue. And people think that is the only, there's different kinds of slavery or different kinds of ways of, we can speak about this. And Islam has a rather different understanding and a surprising understanding in some ways. So I do recommend you actually read some proper, decent, scholarly work on this, rather than this kind of comment, which is very misleading in my view. Wouldn't you say that secularism has caused more wars and casualties than all the religious conflicts have done throughout history? I would put it differently. I would say that atheism has. If you look at the numbers of deaths associated with atheist regimes and their deliberate genocide, thinking of Soviet Russia, millions of people died as a result of that atheist ideology. Mao Zedong's China as well is the biggest killer of all. The worst, the most egregious fanatical mass killings in history by far have been committed by atheist regimes who were trying to benefit humanity. So yeah, in that sense, secularism is slightly different. It's not the same as atheism, but I think atheist ideology, because if you're an atheist, at the end of the day, if 1 million people die, that's just a footnote in history. If you're trying to create a utopia, a much better society, say in 100 years' time, what does it matter if the present generation, many, many millions die? Because it's just a footnote. I mean, there's no God, there's no responsibility. It doesn't matter. The long term, you've got the whole of the future and you can have a better. So why not sacrifice some people now? That kind of logic is actually mentioned. Eric Hobsbawm, the British historian, Jewish historian, who was a Marxist, spoke in these terms about the atrocities that were committed in the name of the Soviet regime, Soviet Russia. So it really can lead to appalling. But if you believe in God, in the afterlife and moral responsibility, you know that everything you do, even cruelty to a cat, there's a hadith about a cat who was starved to death, I think, by a woman, and that woman went to hell because of it. You know, I mean, it's a different world. Atheism is lethal when it comes to the preservation of life, because it doesn't care about it at the end of the day, in my view. Just looking through again. So interesting. Yeah, there is a book over there. I could get it out. I'm too tired. so I'm lazy now, which actually it's a table of the number of deaths caused by Muslims, by Christians, by Jews, by atheists, and so on. And the figures are astonishing. The number of people killed by atheists is by massively higher than those killed in the name of religion. It is astronomically awful. And this is all in the last couple of 100 years, of course. This has happened. Atheism didn't have a regime control until modern times. So this is atheism. I mean, atheism is played with kid gloves in our society, as if it's oh, he's an atheist. It's a lethal ideology when it gets state power, because there's no reason to there's no reason to value life, because life is just a product of random processes in a meaningless universe. If you can sacrifice some lives for the greater good, why not? You know. Could you explain why you don't believe in the gospel of Barnabas? I've done a video on this, on blogging theology. Please look at it. The reasons are very many. It's seen by all scholars as a forgery from probably the 17th or 18th centuries. There are very, very good reasons why. Please see the video for the reasons. So I'm not going to go into that now, because really it's too much for me. So over 2 hours now, and we'll be drawing to a close shortly. What's for dinner? Thank you for asking this question. Well, I've got a nice salad ready, actually. I've got some tuna, lettuce, tomatoes, maybe some eggs. Anyway, so it's going to be a nice salad, I've decided, because the weather here in England, in London, has been very nice. So thanks for that lovely question, getting my mind on food. Oh, this is a good question. Best English translation of the Quran. Well, I don't have a single version. There are several which I think are very good translations. One of the best, the one that's most favored by, in a scholarly context in Britain, in academic context in the West, is this one in English. The Quran, a new translation by Abdul Halim, published by Oxford University Press. That's very good. But there are a number of excellent translations now. They all have their strengths and some have their weaknesses. So I just thought I'd mention that. Abdul Halim is very good. Oh, there are lots of other good translations. There's a new one out. This one, for example, where are we? We probably can't. We need to turn the lights on. Mufti Muhammad Taqi Usmani. His translation of the Quran is beautiful production. This beautiful produced Quran here. So that's very good. But there are so many. There's so many translations. Rogda, thanks a lot for the rich live stream you provided. We appreciate your time. Enjoy your dinner. Thank you, Tam, very much indeed. Noahide laws. Noahide, the word comes from Noah, the great patriarch, mentioned in Genesis, mentioned in the Quran, mentioned in the New Testament. Orthodox Jews, and this is a Jewish idea, of course, not a Christian idea or a Muslim idea. The Orthodox Jews say, and it's not a bad idea, it could be true, that the earth was destroyed in the Great Flood, and Noah and his family were saved in the boat. And God then gave Noah and his descendants some laws, 7 laws to live by. And all the laws are very good. Don't kill, be honest, establish a judicial authority to administer justice, don't commit blasphemy, in other words, worship one God, don't commit sexual immorality, and so on. And but God gave the Jews, they say, obviously on Mount Sinai with Moses, the 613 commandments of the law, the Torah. So Jews don't follow the Noahide laws, they follow the Torah, but they say that the rest of mankind, Gentiles, should follow the Noahide laws. All of these laws are found in Islam, of course. So this is where this idea comes from. It's a Jewish idea. It's found in the Talmud, and it's controversial in that the law that I've asked rabbis about this, the law that says don't commit blasphemy or don't commit idolatry, actually rules out the Christian understanding of God, the worship of Jesus. The law that says don't commit sexual immorality actually rules out all sexual activity and acts outside of heterosexual marriage. So that's not going to be very popular with the the Pride Month people. But anyway, all these laws are found in Islam too, obviously. Bart Ehrman lost his faith due to suffering. Do you think Islam could explain his issues better? Absolutely. I'm not going to go into it now, but he lost his Christian faith. Islam has a set of answers which are not found in Christianity, unfortunately, which are much better. And no Muslim should be losing. No, people don't lose their faith because of suffering. It's part of what it is to live in this life. It's part of what we are here for, is to be tried. It's a trial. It's a probation period. Whereas for Muslims, it's all, oh my God, it's for Christians, I mean, it's a problem. Oh my God, our loving Heavenly Father, why are we suffering? Well, purpose of life. Christians haven't got it quite right. Okay. What's your opinion of the Apostle Peter and the conflict between him and Paul? I think historically there was a conflict between Peter and James, particularly as well. On the one hand, as Jewish people who believed that Jesus was a Messiah, and Paul, who basically preached Jesus as a dying and rising savior figure. So it's like a Hellenistic religion. So I think there is a conflict, if you can see it in the early sources, actually. For example, Paul's letter to Galatians, where he's very critical of Peter and men who came from James, Paul says, to make sure Peter obeyed Jewish rules, and Paul very critical of them both. So yeah, you do see this conflict. Oh, wrong one. Sorry. Noahide law say if you say Jesus Lord, well, maybe. Obviously, the punishments in the Torah are not enacted today. There is no state. There's no Jewish state. I know there's Israel, but that's not seen as there's not a Torah observant state. It doesn't implement the halakha, the Jewish law. But it would certainly see that as wrong, as a great sin to say that about Jesus. I agree. Just looking through. Someone needs to go. Yeah. Yes. Good night to you. I'll be saying the same shortly as well. I could switch on the light here, but I'll do that in a minute when I finish. The next guest, I will make an announcement about that shortly. Not on here, but I've already had Anthony Buzzard on. By the way, he was my first guest, and you can see the video on Blogging Theology. A lovely man, a fellow Englishman. And it's Sir Anthony Buzzard to you and me. But there we go. I'll let you know shortly. I think maybe we're drying up now. I think I can't see any particularly new questions that we haven't already addressed at some point. What's this say? What do you think about using the method of being harsh sometimes in debates versus being charitable and kind in debates? Gosh. I'm guilty of doing both. I can be very harsh, even rude, and that's a problem that particularly at Speaker's Corner, it's a very volatile, turbulent place. I think in proper debates, one should always have good adab, good manners, particularly people one doesn't agree with. One should always be courteous, polite, one should listen, and one should always follow good courtesy. That's not always the Christian view. There are certain Christian missionaries who I won't mention who think being offensive and insulting is perfectly acceptable. But that's not my view. I guess that might be it. I shouldn't look at this. Some scholars also say a second coming concept is corrupted. There's a lot of Israeliyat, as my guest was saying, a lot of Israeliyat in the narrative, the early Muslim narratives of Jesus and the second coming, and so a lot of this is of doubtful authenticity. This is a very difficult area. Can we see a debate on blogging if you're? Yeah, well, Good question. I don't know, actually. The Noahide law is satanic. Well, the Noahide laws say worship God alone. Don't commit sexual immorality. Be just. Love your neighbor. I'm not quite sure what that means, really. If all kids that die go to heaven, what does that mean that the huge decline in child mortality is a trap? I don't know. I don't know. You need to ask the creator about these things. I don't know about them myself. Yes, wasn't Adnan Rashid supposed to come on some? Yes, actually, he said he would. I've not been. I have emailed him a couple of times since. I've not had a response. I think he has been in Africa, doing some dawah activity there. I don't know where he is at the moment. I've not seen him at Speaker's Corner. So this one is, wait and see what happens. But he has certainly, to me, expressed very, very happy to come on. I do hope he comes on. He's a chap who has immense knowledge of history, particularly. And I was very eager to ask him about that. I wanted to ask him about the Crusades. I wanted to ask him about the expansion of the Islamic Empire in the 7th and 8th and 9th centuries. I had lots of questions. So we'll have to wait until he gets back in contact. I don't know him on a day-to-day basis, so we'll have to wait and see. And I think we will leave it there. It's 2 hours 15 minutes, and it's getting dark, and I want my salad. So thank you very much for all your questions, and I'll try and do this each Saturday. Oh, I should say that just over a week's time, I'm going to my other home, because I have another home in the south of France. I haven't been there for a long time because of COVID, but I booked a flight on British Airways, and I fly out to Toulouse Monday week. And I'm glad to say the French government have just changed their rules, so I won't have to quarantine at home for 7 days, so I can go out. So I am officially resident in France as well, so I don't need a visa. I can just live there, but it's also my home. So I have a home here in London and a home in France, and I'm very much looking forward to going back there. It's a very different world. I live in a tiny little village, very chocolate box, picturesque. I can see the Pyrenees on the horizon. I'm surrounded by farms, wildlife, forests. There's only about 200 or 300 people living in the village, and totally French, which is great. And there's a big city not far away, not Toulouse, another one. And I just want to go home there. And so I will be kind of there and here, depending on a whim. Hopefully I'll make some videos, some vlogs from France as well. I'll take some of my books with me. I have some books there, but not as many as I do behind me here. So enjoy cheese. Yeah, I love French cheese. Dribble, dribble, dribble. So I just want to say a lot of French people are good people, Muslims. Muslims need to know that. Okay, there are big problems with France, but nevertheless, we do need to. There are a lot of decent French, nice French people, and I know some of them. Despite the fact that some of them are not very friendly to Muslims at all. So yeah, in terms of blogging theology, it won't make much of a difference. I'm going to carry on doing what I do, but there'll hopefully be a different background next time, a very different background. I'm not going to say what it is. It'll be in English. I won't be doing it in French. And we will see. Or maybe I'll do it outside in the garden or something, with a view over the whatever. There's lots of possibilities for doing it there, and we shall see. But until next time, I will love you and leave you. So take care until next time.